It's the amazing Rico Brogna podcast with your host, Evan Roberts.
Rico Brogna, welcome into another episode of The Rico, episode number 585. Hi, I'm Evan Roberts. If you haven't subscribed to The Rico Brogna, you should do so because we pop out Ricos quite often. And if you listen to the audio version via podcast, you should subscribe because then it's automatically in your inbox or wherever the hell you get podcasts, and it's there for you. If you are consuming this live on YouTube, how are you? On today's edition of the Rico Brogna, we're going to listen to more of David Stearns on episode 584. If you missed it, we analyzed everything David Stearns said, all the questions from day one of the general manager meetings. David Stearns likes to talk, so he spoke again on day two of the GM meetings, and we will do it again. We will listen to what David Stearns had to say, and after each answer, we respond with our opinions. But it wasn't just David Stearns speaking at the GM meetings. It was Scott Boras. Scott Boras is I could almost argue he's the single most powerful man in Major League Baseball. Probably has more power than Tony Clark, probably has more power than Rob Manfred, and really controls free agency with some of the level of players that he represents. And certainly as Met fans, we know he reps Pete Alonso. As a Met fan who may want to add some free agents, he also represents Dylan Cease and Zach Gallen and Cody Bellinger. And even though he's not a free agent yet, he represents Tarek Skubal. So Scott Boras is a very powerful guy. And he spoke for about 48 minutes with many questions coming his way. Now, we are not going to listen to every minute of Scott Boras, but we are going to listen to the Scott Boras answers that I think involve us. So what Scott had to say directly about Pete Alonso, and even a question about Tarek Skubal. Of course, Tarek has one more year left of control, and the Tigers have to make a big decision over the next few months, and that is, do they keep Tarek Skubal with the risk of losing him via free agency, or do they actually trade him during the offseason? So let's start off with Scott Boras, and then we'll eventually get to David Stearns. We will listen to Scott and David's answers, and each time I'll give you my opinion. We'll give you our opinions. And also, this was very popular from episode 584. One of our loyal Rico listeners, Dan, put together a David Stearns translator for some of the things David said in day one of the GM meetings. The David Stearns translator is indeed back. So we'll have that to look forward to later in the episode. But let's start it off with Scott Boras. This was a question very direct, which is, do you think the Detroit Tigers are going to trade Tarek Skubal, your client?
The most recent talks with the Tigers, do you anticipate that they'll keep Skubal instead of trading him?
You know, all we know is that the fans in Detroit want the Tigers to build a Tarek Barrack. You know, they Little Caesars running around town saying "Sai." So it's a kind of thing where he's built a base. Obviously, everywhere they go, they know it's Skubal Day. They understand that organization is substantially different if he's not there. And when you're in these situations and you go through it, all we know is that we hear mostly from the fans, and the player hears from the fans, and it's kind of like it should be Scooby done, right? And if not, I think the fans would certainly think it's a Detroit doink if they don't.
Have they approached you about an extension again at this point, or is that something that you're anticipating?
We talk a lot, and through the concourse of the off season, we'll continue to discuss. Our point of view is that we always listen. We're prepared to listen to about anything that Chris or really Scott has to say. So we'll just see how it goes.
So we got a lot of shtick there. We got a lot of Scott Boras. Let me give you my puns. I think what he is trying to do is I don't think he wants Tarek Skubal to be traded. They're not going to sign an extension there. He's not going to sign an extension anywhere. Like, even if he was traded to the Mets, this magical idea that some fans have of, they're going to give like a 72-hour window to negotiate a long-term contract with Skubal, that's not happening. When you're this close to free agency and you're coming off at least 2 straight Cy Youngs, we'll see if there's a third, depending on what he does in 2026. You want to get to free agency. Once the Detroit Tigers trade Skubal, if that's what they decide to do, you can eliminate them as a suitor. They're gone. Because once they decide to trade him, the odds are very slim that they're going to try to trade him and then sign him. That rarely happens. That's a fantasy. If they don't trade him, there's going to be a lot of pressure on ownership in Detroit from fans to re-sign him. And so along with your obvious contenders, the Mets, the Dodgers, the Red Sox, all the big market teams that would go after him, you'd also have the Detroit Tigers. So look, Scott doesn't have any sway on this. He's not going to be able to get Skubal traded or not traded. But I always think that he would prefer him not to be traded, just so that there's an extra team in the marketplace once he gets to free agency a year from now. Now let's get to Pete Alonso, because obviously that's the client we most care about. Here is a question to Scott Boras concerning the future of Pete Alonso and what will happen in free agency.
Scott, back to Pete for a minute. What do you think he's the franchise's all-time home run leader now. He's popular with the fans, a franchise player. What do you think that means to him as he looks at his future and what he might do?
Pete has been a lifetime Met, and obviously when he reflects on his career, it's all he has to look to. The one thing I think Pete understands, that playing in New York is not something most can do. To become a star-level player in New York, even fewer can do it. And so I think the New York fans recognize it, and they've been very, very outward and appreciative of him. He and Haley's involvement in the community has been received so well. He's in so many ways, from a production, middle lineup, he's an ideal franchise player, plays every day. And it's clear that the New York fans relate to somebody who is workmanlike, who is what Pete is. When I use the term pachydermium-like, I mean he is the elephant that goes out there every day. He is impenetrable, and he really knows how to manage the pressure of that situation. So I think it's something he's very proud of because of the fact that so few have achieved that standing.
When you cut through some of the BS, Scott Boras wants to deliver Pete Alonso to the highest bidder. Let's not get this twisted. But a lot of that answer tells me he knows that Pete Alonso means more to the Mets than any other team. Now, that doesn't mean the Mets are going to be the highest bidder. All it takes is one team just desperate for his power and desperate for his offensive capabilities to blow past the Mets and make a monster offer. But when Scott stressed the community and New York and Met fans, Boras knows that ultimately all of that Pete brings, he brings to the Mets and not necessarily as much value to another team. But I thought this was a good question for Scott Boras, because this is certainly a perception that a lot of Met fans had. I know Hoff's had it, which is that the Mets don't really appreciate Pete Alonso, and they haven't appreciated him in terms of the way they've negotiated with him, specifically last year. So Scott was asked that. Do you think the front office appreciates Pete Alonso?
You mentioned the fans' appreciation of Pete. Do you feel like the Mets front office feels the same way, appreciates him in the same way?
I've met with David and Steve, and again, they're just really, really excited about the year that Pete had. Pete, in his own, again, the guy is such a worker. He made biomechanical adjustments from 24 to 25, which proved to be highly rewarding for him. The metrics that most teams look at were grandly improved, and so he really understands how to consistently take a bat and perform, and I think that's a credit to him for all of his work in the off season to achieve that.
Pete definitely worked his ass off, and you certainly saw that difference. That first part of the answer, Steve Cohen and David Stearns were so excited about the year he had last year. There's no way in their meeting, because Scott did say they've met already, and John Heyman had a report that the tone of the meetings are certainly more positive than they were a year ago. I doubt they were fawning over Pete Alonso's production. I don't think they're going to do that in a contract year, but Scott certainly presents it that way. A few more for Scott Boras about Pete Alonso that I think will be very instructive. One, Alonso's willingness to DH. This has been a very big subject amongst us as Met fans, in the Met fan community. You know, certainly when you read the tea leaves on what David Stearns has talked about in terms of run prevention and defense, the idea that Pete could come back and not necessarily become a full-time DH, but DH more. Scott was asked about Pete Alonso's willingness to do that.
How open is Pete Alonso to DHing if he goes back to the Mets? Is that something he would consider going back?
I think Pete, at this point in his career, he's about winning, no doubt. Had that question a lot. There's no doubt that Pete's pursuers are primed to pay the power piper.
Oh, boy.
You know, Pete picked the perfect period to play preeminently at a primary position. A playoff parched plethora will pounce to participate in the polar plunge.
How open is...
So Scott took a very fair question about DHing, which he did answer rather briefly, and turned it into just giving us as many P's as humanly possible. This does not surprise me. I've said this a few times here on some offseason Ricos. Pete Alonso wants to get paid. And while he's made clear to all of us that he'd rather play first base, look, there's a lot of stuff we would rather do, but we're paid to do a job, right? I do a radio show on WFAN. I'm not going to say what it is, but there are things I'd prefer to do. But I'm paid to be on the radio for 4.5 hours during a certain period of time during the day. And I do it. And I think with Pete Alonso, it's kind of the same thing. He would prefer to play first base 162 games. But I think that if the Mets re-sign him or the Red Sox sign him or whatever team signs him to that big money contract, he's going to do what they tell him to do. Now, I view Pete Alonso's ultimate value as still playing first base, but cutting down on that number by maybe DHing, let's find the happy medium, 50 games, 30 games, dare I say 100 games? And I think a lot of that depends on the rest of your roster. So I'm not surprised by that answer, but for those that looked at Alonso and said, I only want him back if he shows a real willingness to DH, that brief answer by Scott Boras tells you that there is a willingness to do so. The number one thing is paying Pete Alonso. That's going to be the most important thing. So before Boras went into the P's, he definitely confirmed that, yes, if asked, Pete Alonso will be the designated hitter when need be. And depending on the way the Mets build this roster, assuming they can bring Pete Alonso back, I think we would all then have a better idea on how many games that should be. Let's hear more from Scott Boras about Pete Alonso.
Do you think his negotiations with the Mets last year will at all color any way the negotiations this year?
You know, the focus on Pete is that, they all talk about the fact that he is his durability. You know, he's a guy that really has a nature about him where it's just his duty no matter how he feels or what he does, to be on the field. And when you're in rooms for a couple days with teams, it's funny with, all of the, the elements. What they say is, Pete possesses a pachydermian-like perseverance. I mean, he has a nature about him that is so, and don't get me wrong, power, production, punishing pitchers, they're fully aware of his skill, but what I think they most pay attention to is the core element of what he can do to provide a team that consistency of 40 home runs, power, and production. And because they're just not finding it. They're finding a lot of players in the market that are somewhat there and somewhat not.
Durability. It's certainly one of the most appealing things about Pete Alonso. He is right, and he should stress that with every team he talks to. Here's the last one from Scott Boras concerning Pete Alonso's defense.
What would you say about concerns about his defense as far as his range goes?
When you look at the number of first basemen that can play 100 games, you'd have to rank Pete right up there in the top 7 or 8, because there aren't many first basemen that can play first base and keep the position. They just don't want to play people there, forgive the pun, but it's become a platoon, except for Pete.
I don't understand the pun, and I'm sure I'll get a lot of emails from people explaining it, but excuse the pun, platoon, Pete. I don't know. Maybe that's me. Maybe I'm being dense. Maybe it's too late at night, or maybe Scott Boras has just bored us all to tears. Either way, what is my grand conclusion from Scott Boras? My grand conclusion is this. The obvious, he wants to get him paid. We all know that. I think Scott Boras knows that his best avenue to getting Pete Alonso his biggest contract may actually be the Mets, because they need him, or they should value him more than every other team. Now, that doesn't mean they're ultimately going to make the highest offer, because if David Stearns secretly says, I'm not going more than 3 years, all it takes is one team to go 4 or 5, and then he's gone. But when you hear Scott talk about New York and the Met fan and the history and the community, I think that's him realizing that his best avenue to get him paid is through the New York Mets. But I think you have to like the answers concerning DH. It certainly keeps that wide open as a possibility. Now let's shift over to the president, David Stearns. Again, if you missed David Stearns in day 1 of the general manager meetings, just go back to episode 584. But right now we listen to more questions for David Stearns. This was day 2 of the general manager meetings. So take it away, David Stearns.
You also have an alliterative speech about Pete Alonso.
I'm not as well rehearsed as others.
So he's not going to give us rhymes. What a disappointment. We have to stick with Scott Boras to get rhymes. All right, here's number 2 for David Stearns.
Scott had mentioned that Pete seems at least open or amenable to the idea of being a DH. How does that kind of affect your value of him and your idea of how he fits into this roster?
Pete's clearly a really good offensive player, and I think, for any team, the ability to get his bat in the lineup in multiple ways is helpful, and it's great to know that Pete is open to stuff like that.
You know what I wonder about this whole openness to DHing? The Mets didn't have a lot of great options last year to do this. In 2025, what were their other first base options? It was essentially Mark Vientos or maybe Jeff McNeil. Those were really the only guys on the team that they could put there. But let's say they had a Dom Smith on the roster. They had an alternative defensively at first base that was better than Pete Alonso. Are we trying to think that Pete wouldn't have DH'd? I mean, that's ridiculous. Just because Alonso has said publicly, yes, I prefer to play first base, he's never refused to be the designated hitter. The makeup of the roster, at least last year, and certainly the last couple of years, has never kind of fit using Alonso as a half the time of the year designated hitter. So I think we're making too big of a deal about his willingness. If the roster allowed, and there was other guys on this team that were so much better defensively at first base, then they would have done it. I don't foresee or ever thought that Pete Alonso would have made an issue over that. So I really think between fans and even the questions about it, I think it's completely overrated. If they pay the man and he's here, he'll DH if they ask him. I don't think it's that complicated. He's never shown us that he's going to refuse just because he has a preference one way or the other. Let's hear question number 3 for David Stearns.
It's been for you the last couple of days.
Yeah, these meetings are always a combination of, good portion of the day. Each day is tied up with MLB-oriented meetings and industry-related issues, and then a segment of the day is more meeting with different agents, talking to different teams. So we've been pretty busy, but kind of standard for what these meetings are. It's generally pretty full days, and try to just get a sense for where everyone is at this stage of the offseason. And as I said yesterday, I think everyone more or less understands that these are really long off seasons, and needs change, agendas change, positions on certain players can change over the course of the off season. And so this is really helpful just to get a starting point as we get going.
Laying the groundwork and meat for us as fans to feast on rumors, but very little action. That's the general manager meetings in a nutshell. Here's question number 4 for David Stearns.
How do you feel about the DH position in general? I mean, could you lock in a big contract like that in that spot, or do you want the flexibility there, or how do you look at it?
I think you could look at it both ways. I don't have a set philosophy there. I think as we look at our team, we don't have that set DH at present. We have multiple players who could take at bats at DH, but we don't have someone who is going to live there right now. So that opportunity is open. And if that's how we work through the offseason, that works out great. If we get to opening day and we don't have that set position, I also think that provides Mendy with some flexibility to rotate some guys through there. So I don't think there was one right or wrong way to do that.
Yeah, I think that if they lose Alonso, Kyle Schwarber is a natural replacement in terms of replacing his power. The negative of Kyle Schwarber is he lives at designated hitter. Like, that's it. He's going to DH, and, God forbid you stick him out in right field for 5 days. It isn't going to be pretty. Alonso returning and then adding another bat, whether it is a Cody Bellinger or a player like that, allows you to use the DH spot as Brandon Nimmo DHs a lot, Pete Alonso DHs a lot. If Mark Vientos is still around, he DHs a lot. I always think that's more ideal. But I would tend to agree. I don't think you want to marry yourself one way or the other, because there could be a time in this postseason or this offseason where Kyle Schwarber does make the most sense. The negative, though, is while you can improve yourself defensively at first base, because I assume Pete's not going to be back if you're signing Kyle Schwarber. That would be more of a replacement for Pete. You're locking yourself up at DH. Now, it allows you to improve yourself defensively elsewhere. But when you look at some of the guys under contract long-term, like Brandon Nimmo is here for a while. Lindor is here for a while. Soto clearly here for a while. And we'll see about Pete if they re-sign him. You're going to want to use the DH spot to not only get yourself upgrades defensively, but more than that, as guys get older, they get injury prone. I said this the other day about Brandon Nimmo. Brandon Nimmo should DH a lot in 2026. And that's not me making a statement about his defense in left field more than it is, it's probably going to behoove him to not be running out and playing the field 140 times. Here's the next question for David Stearns. I think it's question number 5.
Do you guys still feel like you need to give Vientos a balance between playing in the field to further develop his defense and the DH at bats?
Look, I think Mark's playing time is and always will be driven by his bat. He is a bat-first player. He works very hard on his defense, but he is a bat-first player. And I think he will go, and his playing time will go how his bat goes.
You have to love honesty. I mean, who doesn't love honesty? But that was brutal honesty. That was, I mean, I'll whip out the David Stearns translator for a second before we get to Dan, who put it together himself. My David Stearns translator on that answer is Mark Vientos blows defensively. That was the answer. Like he is so bad defensively that, and I'm smiling as I say it, which David was too. You can tell in his answer that his playing time is driven by his bat because God knows his glove stinks. That was the answer. And then you throw in there, but God help his soul because he tries. It's like talking about a 5-year-old that's trying really hard, but you try really hard. I mean, I respect the honesty because spot the lie. There really isn't a lie. Mark Vientos is an offensive player. He is not a defensive player. I think it helps, though, even when you're a bad defensive player, to at least be capable of playing the field. I think that's a big help. I think when you become exclusively a designated hitter, first of all, you better hit a lot more and be more consistent if you're going to be just locked in as a DH. But there's a value, even if you're not great defensively, at being able to play numerous positions and being able to go out there and make a start at third base or make a start at first base. No one's ever going to confuse you with Rico Brogna at first or Brooks Robinson at third, but there's a value to being able to do it. But clearly, based on that answer by David Stearns, don't expect to see a lot of defense from Mark Vientos. If he's on the team in 2026, and that is a question, it's going to be because he's mashing and he's hitting. And he could fit that DH role, even in a world in which Alonso's DHing 40 games and Brandon Nimmo's DHing 40 games, because there's still a whole bunch of other games for someone to DH. And Mark Vientos can certainly take that role. Next up for David Stearns, question number 6.
What does he need to do to get back to the 2024 form?
Yeah, I think Mark had this, really magical season and magical second half in 24 that culminated with one of the better postseason performances in Mets history. And that's a really high bar for a young player to get back to. And for Mark, I think it starts with swinging at the right pitches. When he's going well, he has the ability to lay off of the spin away out of the zone. And when he's pressing a little bit, that can become a challenge. And so that's probably a good starting point. And then, like any power hitter, when you get the pitch, got to hit it hard somewhere. And throughout his career, that's kind of been Mark's gift. Is he hits the ball really hard, and if he can do that consistently, he's going to be a really good player.
Hit. That's it. That's the answer. Hit consistently. He was wildly inconsistent in 2025. You could try to figure out the whys. The whys don't matter. What matter is that the results weren't there. He lost his job. And even looking ahead to 2026, it's an unknown on what his role will be. He's got to hit. If he hits, he'll play. If he doesn't hit, he becomes useless. Here's question number 7 for David Stearns.
Francisco Lindor had a little bit of a defensive down year. How much do you attribute that to some of the ailments that he'd been going through during the season?
Yeah, I think Francisco, he plays such a demanding position. He plays every day. He competes so hard every day. And I think he's a pretty self-motivated individual that he's going to work really hard to get back to as good a defender as he can possibly be. I do think some of it was a product of some of the physical limitations he had this year. And he's working hard to ensure that doesn't impact him again going forward.
I have confidence that Lindor will bounce back defensively. This is a guy that's won multiple Gold Gloves. This is a guy that's won a Platinum Glove. We do need to keep something in mind. On opening day, Francisco Lindor is going to be 32 years old. And it's just natural that when you're in your 30s at shortstop, your defensive skills start to move backwards. Now, I don't think we're anywhere close to Lindor being a below average defensive shortstop, or even that conversation about moving him off of shortstop, which happens to a lot of shortstops late in their career, unless they're as egotistical as Derek Jeter and they just stay there until basically it's over painfully. But when talking about Lindor's defense, injuries absolutely probably played a toll. There's no question Hill will work his tuchus off, and it would not surprise me if he bounces back with a Gold Glove year. But we do have to keep in mind next season, 2026, he's going to be 32 years old. And that's what happens when you get older, especially at a position like shortstop. Question number 8 for David Stearns.
That broken, was it toe?
Yeah.
Toe, yeah, that played into it.
I think for a little while the toe played into the lateral range, and then I think as we got towards the end of the season, some elbow discomfort played into the arm strength. I think when you combine those and you're playing every single day at Major League shortstop, it's gonna cause you to probably not make a couple of plays that you normally would make.
And this is something that we brought up prior to the 25 season, and it didn't happen. I'll bring it up again prior to the 26 season. Because Lindor is 32, because Lindor is signed for 1 million more years, because Lindor plays every single day, shouldn't there be a tad more DH days? We talked before about Nimmo and Alonso and, dare I say, even Juan Soto, though David Stearns sort of dismissed that the other day, Soto DHing. Maybe that number is only 15. Not saying it's got to be an enormous number. But when you look at the injuries that Lindor battles, would it not behoove him to play shortstop? Now, you look at the roster, the Mets potentially may have 3 options concerning guys that can go play the position and give them an opportunity. Luis Angel Acuna, Ronnie Mauricio, and even Jet Williams. No guarantee all 3 guys are going to be on the roster. Who knows? But it feels like 1 or 2 of them will. And so it not only allows an opportunity for a young player to play their natural position, but if Lindor is battling injury and the Mets don't have a full-time, everyday lockdown designated hitter, it may help to have Lindor DH a little bit more. I don't know if that'll happen. We'll ask Carlos Mendoza in spring training when we get there. But I brought that up last year. Didn't seem to happen. He's a year older. He's coming off a year in which he played, but he battled all those nagging injuries, and apparently it affected his defense. So why not DH him more? Here's question number 9 for David Stearns.
David, for teams that are maybe looking for center field help from like next acquisition standpoint, are there particular challenges with that market?
I don't know. Look, center field's a premium position. It can be difficult at premium positions to find players who are really good defenders and really good offensive players. That's why we're really happy we have Francisco Lindor, right? And we're really excited about some of the players who are coming through our system because we think they can be those type of two-way players at premium positions. But I don't look at this center field class in terms of what's available in free agency or what's available in trade as necessarily lighter than we would expect for premium positions in a standard offseason.
With David Stearns saying the other day Carson Bench has a chance to be the opening day center fielder, and with Jet Williams potentially being really close and center field being an option, I feel less, need to trade for a center fielder. Whether it's talking to Boston about Duran or Chicago with Luis Robert Jr., I think that the Mets have good internal options. Obviously they could sign a Bridge if they don't believe in Tyrone Taylor. They could go the Cody Bellinger route with him playing center field until Benj is ready, and then eventually playing a lot of left field with Brandon Nimmo DHing and playing a lot of first base with Pete Alonso DHing. But I think with the internal options the Mets have at center field, let's keep fingers crossed, because I think a part of team success is getting performances from your younger players, is having your younger players step up and contribute. That was a big part of the success they had in 2024. And I look at center field and say, yeah, they're going to need guys to step up. Benj or Jet Williams, but probably Benj at this point, because I think Jet may end up more as a second baseman. Here's question number 10 for David Stearns.
Is McNeil still in the mix for center field?
I think probably less. I think we love Jeff's positional versatility, but I don't see us looking at that as a significant portion of his time next year.
Gee, God, I hope not. Look, I commend Jeff McNeil. I do. I commend that during his rehab assignment, he was playing center field. I commend that he went out there, and I thought for the most part did a good job, and I'm grading on a curve. I'm not literally grading him as a regular center fielder because he's Jeff McNeil. And yeah, there's that play in Philadelphia that rings kind of in our head. I thought he did a fine job going out there. But if Jeff McNeil is playing center field for any significant amount of time, then David Stearns failed this offseason. And the younger players failed. Because a part of it, as I mentioned earlier, is believing and relying on Benj and Jet Williams to make that jump. And if they don't, and you're forced to have McNeil in center field, that's a problem. Assuming Jeff McNeil's even on the team, which I'm certainly still skeptical will be the case. Here's question 11 for David Stearns.
Given that Nimmo and Soto are defensively considered subpar, are you looking for a glove-first center fielder? Is that kind of the focus there?
I think what I'd say to the first part of that question is we think both of those guys have the ability to be above-average defenders. And so our focus is to do everything we can to help them both be above-average defenders, and I think they're committed to doing that. In terms of center field, it's a premium position up the middle. We'd love to have a plus defender out there. I think Tyrone Taylor is a plus defender, and so that's a good start to have him under control right now. And where we go from there, we'll see.
Yeah, I'm curious about what kind of defender Carson Bench is going to look like. Reading scouting reports, he's viewed as a guy with a really good arm, which is nice, and is viewed as a guy that probably could shift over to right field or left field. But obviously, with the way the Mets are built, with Nimmo in left and Soto in right, he needs to play center field. I think getting to watch him every day will certainly give us a better idea. That answer by David Stearns saying, yes, Nimmo can be better. Yes, Soto can be better. Fine. Everybody can be better with hard work. But yeah, he wants defense in center field. And that's why I bring up Harrison Bader. I know that's annoying, and maybe he's out of the Mets price range considering what they're going to look for in center field, more of a transition player. But one thing about Bader, say what you want about this guy, he can defend. He can defend at a very high level. Tyrone Taylor's a good defender too. He's already here, so he could be that guy we're talking about. Here is the next question, question number 12 for David Stearns.
What more can you guys do to aid them defensively, and not just Nimmo and Soto, but you said yesterday that the guys who are coming back all need to be better defensively. Yeah. What more can you guys do to help them get better?
So I think the first thing is the recognition that it's just as important as offense. And we have a tendency in this game, because this is not just the Mets, it's everywhere, because offense is so much easier to see, and scoring runs is so much easier to see, in some ways easier to measure than preventing runs, especially defensively, that we focus so much of our training time and our efforts and our energy on how can I get better offensively, how can I get the most out of myself on any given day from an offensive production standpoint. And at times we forget about the other side of the ball. And so I think step one is ensuring that we all understand how important the other side of the ball is. Step two is I think we're very excited about the coaching staff we're putting together to help our players get better defensively.
Defense is important. I understand that. The Mets had an average offense last year. I don't want David Stearns to forget that. The Mets, if you compare them to their rivals in the National League, were 6th in runs scored. That wasn't good enough. Now, that doesn't make them a bad offensive team. Not saying they are. They're not the Pirates. They weren't the Nationals. But they weren't good enough. So I get the defense, and I understand you got to work harder. That's essentially his answer. Work harder on your defense. Okay, fine. They need to score more runs next year than they scored this year. That's the facts. They have to do better with that. So we spend so much time talking about defense, and I get it. Their defense wasn't good enough, but let's not ignore the fact that their offense was also not good enough. Here's question 13 for David Stearns.
Every year, trends seem to emerge, especially in October. Kind of narratives take off. The splitter usage this year was a big one. The Toronto's contact. Do you take away anything from stuff that you notice from other teams while you're watching at home? You're like, we're going to implement this a little more, or is it just like, hey, we're doing our own thing? We already know what we're doing.
I think you always try to learn from what your competitors are doing. I think we probably will shy away from sort of learning from the narratives that emerge each offseason, because to your point, they change from postseason to postseason. They change depending on who actually won the last game. The narrative for this year might be slightly different if, let's say, the Mariners happen to get to the World Series instead of the Blue Jays, or if the Blue Jays had happened to win the World Series instead of the Dodgers. I think maybe the lessons you draw then are slightly different. But I do think it's important that we are constantly watching what our competitors are doing and trying to glean whether they're doing anything better than we are.
Yeah, I think we make too big of a deal every time we crown a world champion by saying we have to be like them. There is no perfect science to winning. And I think the Dodgers are such a great example of it, because the Dodgers this past year won with starting pitching. That's why they won the World Series. Their starting pitching was so good, and it was so deep, and they were sort of lucky because all of these injury-prone players, specifically Tyler Glasnow, Shohei Ohtani, they were healthy at the right time. Blake Snell, they were healthy at the right time. Those three guys were not healthy in the first half of the year. Yamamoto, give him all the credit in the world. He had a wonderful year, ended up finishing third in the National League Cy Young voting. But those other three guys were not healthy. The Dodgers had an injury-prone starting rotation that got healthy at the exact right time, and it carried them to a championship. Congratulations. The year before that, they had no starting pitching. The year before that, they were using bullpen games and Jack Flaherty and a not quite as good Yoshinobu Yamamoto. And so the Dodgers relied on their bullpen. Their bullpen was deep. Their bullpen was long. This year, their bullpen stunk. So I think the Dodgers are a great example that there is no exact science to winning a world championship. So you don't want to get too nuts about we have to copy the Blue Jays, or we have to copy the Mariners, or we have to copy this, or we have to copy that. You know, you just need to be good. That's what you need to be. Here's question 14 for David Stearns.
You spoke yesterday about the plan to add relievers for the bullpen. Just how does Dylan Ross fit into that, and what you like about his year last year?
Yeah, I think Dylan's a guy who's going to come to camp with a chance to make our team. It's a big arm. A unique guy who throws really hard, who can also zone up his secondary stuff. It's elite stuff. We got to work to help him get in the zone a little bit more. He doesn't need to be a premium strike thrower, but he can get in the zone a little bit more, and I think that'll help him at the major league level. And we would expect him to contribute throughout the season next year.
Dylan Ross was one of those guys that was on the Syracuse shuttle at the very end. The Mets called him up for the last few games of the season against the Marlins. He had zoomed up the system, pitching in Brooklyn and Binghamton and Syracuse, and put up some very big strikeout numbers that just blow you away. But he never got into a game. We never saw him. He is one of those guys that I put on that list of a guy that can absolutely have a good spring training, make the bullpen, and become one of those guys that really has a big impact on the bullpen in 2026. So he is certainly a guy to keep an eye on, but I guess he never really was officially in the Syracuse shuttle because he got called up once or maybe twice and never pitched. He never got into a game. He was out there. He was ready to go during that final series against the Marlins, but never actually got into a game. Let's hear the next question, number 15 for David Stearns.
Ronnie Mauricio kind of got buried last maybe 6 weeks. Yeah. In retrospect, do you maybe wish he could have gotten some going down to Syracuse and gotten at bats, or how do you look at that?
That was a complicated one because we were trying to both do what was the best possible thing for our major league team, have the best 26 players up at the major league level as we possibly could, care about Ronnie's development, and also ensure that we had the ability to option Ronnie in 2026. Right. He missed so much development time, and had we sent him back down to AAA, we would have burned his last option. Okay. So by keeping him up for that last month, even though he wasn't playing a lot, we preserved the last option. He now has the ability to go through, if he needs it, the entirety of a developmental year and get some real at-bats under him.
Do you think he'll play winter ball?
He's going to play a little bit of winter ball, yes.
Well, hopefully in winter ball he stays healthy because that's where he had that injury a couple of years ago. How about that honesty? And maybe we shouldn't be surprised by that, but we talked about that late in 2025, that one of the reasons Ronnie Mauricio wasn't sent down was to preserve that final option. And Hoff and I argued about it because I know it pissed Pete off, but my answer was there's a value to that. And also, he was one of the best 26 guys. So if they had sent him down, even though he was on mothballs, who was coming up? Like, who needed to be up here? Who also, by the way, was never going to play. So isn't it worth the optionability of being able to send him down in 2026, if need be, if that's what the roster calls for, as opposed to sending him down in 2025 for really no good reason? I mean, yes, it would have helped his development by getting more at-bats, but the guy who was coming up wasn't even going to help the team. It wasn't going to make a big difference. So I'm glad he said it because I do think that's the main reason why he remained on the roster, even though he was on mothballs. Here's the mistake, and this is not a David Stearns mistake. This is a Carlos Mendoza mistake, in my opinion. I think a part of managing is getting all of your guys involved, never letting someone sit for way too long. I thought Bobby Valentine was great at that, where guys would not rot for too long a period of time. So even though maybe it annoys you, like, why is Ronnie Mauricio in the lineup? I think it is important to keep guys fresh because you never know when you're going to need them. And look what happened. Brett Beatty got hurt the final weekend of the year, and all of a sudden they needed Ronnie Mauricio, and he had barely played. What do you expect? So I think the handling of Mauricio, I had a bigger issue with Mendy's managing on it than I did David Stearns allowing him to remain on the roster. Mauricio's role, though, in 2026 is a major question, assuming he's still here. Question 16 for David Stearns.
Are you guys okay with that, given what happened last time you played winter ball? Or is
yeah,
it
look,
right now about
yeah, we look, what happened last time was incredibly unfortunate. We also can't let a somewhat freak injury prevent us from what's likely best for a player and his future.
Yeah, I mean, I made a joke about it, but no, it's better for Ronnie Mauricio to play baseball. And, of course, you keep your fingers crossed that there's no crazy injury.
Focus on a certain position in winter ball?
Some of that's going to be – he's going to play around the infield, but some of that's going to depend on what the needs of the winter ball team are.
Yeah, I don't think it matters because even with the Mets, what's his position here? I mean, where would you even play him? He's not the shortstop. I don't think he's the third baseman based on the way Beatty played. So it's really second base. Maybe if it's in learning, maybe if it's even learning first base. I think Mauricio could get a lot of at-bats at DH, depending on the way the roster falls, especially a Vientos Mauricio platoon at DH could be something that makes sense. Mauricio is so much better against right-handed pitching as a left-hand hitter. So obviously the roster will dictate if that's the case. But I can see Mauricio getting a lot of at-bats at DH.
Understanding that you want to improve defensively, do you feel like there is an added risk of having more contact-heavy pitchers as opposed to guys with swing and miss stuff?
I think in a perfect world, you have pitchers who generate elite swing and miss. There is a little bit of a balance there as pitchers who generate elite swing and miss. Often at times they're going to run higher pitch counts. Tougher to get a little bit deeper into games. We ran into that at times this year where we weren't getting deep enough into games. So sure, I'd love to have a little bit more swing and miss on our staff. I think we are going to get there with the young players we have coming who almost all of them generate above average swing and miss, and I think we'll continue to do so. With that said, we are going to have some contact-oriented pitchers on our team, and when balls are put in play, we need to do everything we can to convert them into outs.
Yeah, and I think third base you feel good about with Beatty, assuming he's there. Lindor, we talked about, should bounce back defensively, and we'll see what the right side of the infield looks like. Question number 19 for David Stearns.
Apologies if you were asked this yesterday, but would Jeff McNeil be a real possibility for first base for a playing time?
I don't think we have any set plans yet as to what Jeff's exact positional distribution is going to be. I think it's a huge benefit to our club that he can fit in a number of different ways. And if we get to the point where we think first base makes some sense, we'll talk to him about it.
Jeff McNeil's being traded. That's what I take out of that answer. We don't know. We don't have any position ideas yet for him because he's probably going to be in Seattle next year. Talk to them.
Did you notice who asked that question?
No.
If I'm correct, it sounded like Andy Martino, who I think was last week got under your and I skin when Sal Licata brought it up that there's a possibility that that McNeil and Vientos could be the first baseman next season, that they could try to team up.
Yeah, Sal says to me, what do you think of Jeff McNeil and Mark Vientos platooning at first base if they lose Pete? And I said, no. I mean, that's freaking awful. But I wasn't even that mad about it because I was like, that's not going to happen. I'm not worried about it because if the Mets lose Alonso, which is absolutely on the table, I think they're going to go external. I think that there's going to be, and it may not, let me rephrase that. It could be internal, like they could sign Alex Bregman and convert Brett Beatty to first base, like something of that nature. But I don't see a world in which Mark Vientos, who David Stearns has already crapped on as a guy who can't defend, and Jeff McNeil, who he basically just said, yeah, we're going to trade him. He's not going to be on the team. I don't see any scenario where those guys are sharing first base. But, yeah, I mean, if you're building depth charts on November 12th, sure, why not?
Hey, just in case. You never know. And Jeff McNeil's a utility guy. You never know.
Here's question number 20 for the president of the New York Mets, David Stearns.
Given some of the short starts you guys had yesterday, is there any sort of appetite for like the traditional long man role out of the bullpen?
Something we've talked about is especially after the trade deadline, we got to the point where we had a lot of one-inning relievers in our pen, and you can do that for a short period of time. But when you combine that with lack of length out of the starters, which is what we had, especially in the month of August, it taxes you, and we got taxed. So there's a recognition that having some multi-inning flexibility out of the pen is going to be important for us.
I want someone to ask about using the tag teams, because I thought when the Mets did that in desperation in September, I could see how you could make that work over the course of 162. Now, you can't tag team all of your starters, but you could. I mean, you could do one or two in a given rotation. But, yeah, I think the Mets need a long man. I think in this DH world where you don't have to worry about double switching or the pitcher hitting, it's good to have a guy, maybe even two, who could give you length just in case you go to your bullpen really early in a game. Question number 21 for David Stearns.
Do you see guys working internally for that, or is that something where you may?
I think there are candidates internally for that. It's something we're also going to look externally, whether it's major league signings, waiver claims, minor league signings, but pitchers who have the ability to give you more than 3 outs at a time.
Well, you also have the starting pitchers who don't make your rotation. We went through that last year with guys like Paul Blackburn, and it could have been a Tyler McGill or Griffin Canning, but they needed them in the rotation. Those are the other possibilities to eat up, not just 2 innings. I'm talking about 3 or 4 innings out of the bullpen.
He said the one thing that gets my blood boiling, waiver claims. That just seems to piss me off.
You got to get over it. It's a part of baseball, man. Sometimes you got to claim guys off waivers, man.
Yeah, but okay. And just really quickly, I get the philosophy and why you could use it to your advantage. However, isn't it more of a stable situation, or more of not even stable, but a better approach of let's get guys who we know are going to be able to perform. You can't predict health. You can't predict health.
You're talking about a long man out of the bullpen. Like, even think back to the late 90s. Some of our favorite long men out of the bullpen. Pat Mahomes, Darren Oliver. Like, those are guys that you're probably signing on the dustpan of free agency or their waiver claims. Like, if you're that good, you're a starting pitcher who's getting paid $18 million a year. Or you're a top reliever. So keep in mind the role that we're talking about. We're talking about the 7th and 8th guy out of the bullpen who can maybe eat up multiple innings, who, by the way, you may want to have options on, because sometimes when you eat up a bunch of innings, you're useless for the next 5 days, so you're better off being sent down. Brandon Waddell was like a perfect innings eater. Now, I don't want to make it a start. That's for damn sure. But eating up 4 or 5 innings in that rare occasion in which your starting pitcher sucks, yeah, it's not something you're signing to a big-time contract. That's where you're going to find guys like that.
No, I get that. But you know what? Maybe I'm just scarred from this past season that we saw
those
a lot
guys
of
were good. The Syracuse shuttle was one of the best parts of the 2025 Mets. It was the paid starters that stunk.
Again, I've said this before. We've made numerous occasions. We've talked about the Syracuse shuttle. We've talked about Clay Holmes as the best parts about the New York Mets. That's not a real great claim to fame for 2025.
I'm not saying it's a claim to fame. I'm saying that part is not something that's worthy of complaining about since they did their job. That's all I'm saying. Here's question number 22 for David Stearns.
Anybody besides Mauricio going to play winter ball?
Acuna's playing winter ball. Yeah, he's playing right now. Brazo might for a little while. Brazopan. I think that's it.
All right, so a bunch of guys playing some winter ball. Why not? get in there, get some action. Here's the next question for David Stearns.
How do you view Acuna moving forward, given that you have so many young infielders and still some coming in the minor leagues right now?
Yeah, look, Acuna is such a unique player because the floor is so high of what he can provide because he's such a good defender, gifted defender in multiple positions, and an elite base runner. And so the offensive contribution doesn't need to be elite for him to solidify an everyday role on a major league team. So I still have very high hopes for him. We need to see a little bit more offensive contribution than we've probably seen previously, but he is a very, very good defensive player, and there's a real role for that on a good team.
Luisangel Acuna, despite not hitting virtually at all last year, needs to be on the 26-man roster. Because, and I don't know, David didn't specifically say this, but when he said he has a really high floor, yes, in a world in which he never hits and never develops into a star or an everyday player, his defense and speed off the bench is so valuable that I want him on the team. In a world in which there's a Manfred man on second base, like unless that Manfred man is Juan Soto or one of your elite level players, Luisangel Acuna is always coming off your bench and being that pinch runner in the 10th inning. Luisangel Acuna is always coming off your bench to improve defense. Luisangel Acuna, even without offense, even without ever becoming like some kind of star that maybe some Met fans thought he could be, is really valuable to this team. I want that guy on my team. I want a guy who's that speedster, who's got a great glove. Could he develop into something more than that? Sure. I'm not going to put limitations on him. I'm just telling you that even at the bare minimum, there is a value to Luisangel Acuna. I think we're up to question number 24, so we got a few more left for David Stearns, and then we'll take a look at the David Stearns translator. So here's number 24, I presume, for David Stearns.
All of the closers on the market right now, or this winter, how do you think that could affect Edwin Diaz's value?
I don't know that it affects Edwin's value. I mean, I think Edwin has demonstrated his value consistently. I think he's one of the best closers in baseball. He's proven that, and so I don't know that the volume of closers necessarily impacts him.
It doesn't, because he's the best. He's the tone setter. Edwin Diaz is the best closer out there, and there was a report that he's looking for a very similar contract to what he had recently signed with the Mets that he opted out of, $90 million or $100 million over 5 years. I got to tell you, look, there's risk with every contract. I acknowledge that. I'd give it to him. Now, maybe I'm the worst negotiator of all time. Maybe I look at how difficult it would be to replace him, and I say, you know what? I'd rather risk the back end of that contract not being great, or there's a year that he misses because of injury like we saw 2 years ago, or there's a decline. I'd rather risk that than risking trying to replace him. Because trying to replace Edwin Diaz it feels impossible. And even if you do it for a year, like even if you sign Kenley Jansen on a 1-year deal, and he's great, he does a fantastic job in 2026, then what? You know, and internally, you like to think of, well, maybe one of my arm develops, maybe one of my young starters gets converted. I mean, that working out is a major risk. It doesn't mean it can't happen. Of course it can. I mean, Mariano Rivera is the greatest story of all when it comes to something like that. But I just think it's easier and probably the safer bet to pay Edwin Diaz. Here is the last question from day 2 of the GM meetings for David Stearns.
David, if you guys didn't re-sign Edwin Diaz, would you be open to maybe utilizing multiple players in that ninth inning role?
I don't know. I think, if we don't sign a particular player, we'll kind of cross that bridge. But as I said, we're going to fill multiple vacancies in our pen. I would expect some of them are going to be more back end oriented, and I would expect some of them will be more help us fill out other parts of the game.
If they lose Edwin Diaz, they're going to sign a traditional closer. Who will that be? Is it Robert Suarez? Is it Pete Fairbanks? Is it someone else? I'm not sure, but I'd be very surprised if it's a myriad of relievers. I mean, it could turn into that if the guy doesn't pitch well, but I think that they would probably target a backup plan. Now, we just heard to David Stearns and heard a lot of his answers. We now present to you the David Stearns translator, courtesy of one of our loyal listeners, Dan. when David Stearns says Jeff McNeil would probably see less playing time in center field. Remember that answer. Here's what the Stearns translator says. Do you realize how desperate we had to be to even have him out there in the first place? I'm begging somebody, please take him so he can yell at himself while smashing his helmets and bats somewhere else. Squirrels suck. David Stearns was talking about Dylan Ross when he said Dylan's a guy who's going to come to camp with a chance to make our team. We would expect him to contribute throughout the season next year. The Stearns translator says, if you log on a FanDuel Sportsbook right now, the over-under of times this kid will be sent back and forth from the minors is currently 112.5. Hammer that over. David Stearns on Scott Boras saying Pete Alonso would be open to DHing more. Pete's clearly a really good offensive player. For any team, the ability to get his bat in the lineup in multiple ways is helpful. It's great to know Pete is open to stuff like that. The Stearns translator says, I didn't even want to bring him back last year. And you think him pretending he wants the DH is going to change my mind? Can somebody please just offer this guy 7 years so I never have to think about him ever again? David Stearns was asked about Mark Vientos and the balance between playing third base and DHing. Mark's playing time is always and will always be driven by his bat. He's a bat-first player. He works very hard on his defense, but he's a bat-first player. The Stearns translator says there aren't enough defensive drills in the world to make him playable in the field. I don't even care if he turns into 0-1 Bonds. I've already instructed the equipment guy to burn all of his gloves the second he gets to camp. The Stearns translator is literally my favorite part. And finally, David Stearns on Luis Angel Acuña's place on the Mets. Acuña is such a unique player because the floor is so high of what he can provide. The offensive contribution doesn't need to be elite to solidify an everyday role on a major league team. The Stearns translator says, we absolutely torpedoed any chance this kid had at being a quality major league hitter. So he's going to pinch run and come in the eighth inning for defense for the rest of his baseball life and like it. Well done, Dan. Little comic relief at the end of David Stearns' day 2 GM meetings. We got a lot of Ricos coming up over the next few days. We are going to try to open up the Rico mailbag and a deep dive on the position players in free agency. It's all coming up on the Rico Brogna over the next couple of days. Remember to subscribe to the Rico so you never miss an episode, or stay subscribed to the WFAN YouTube page so you can watch the Rico live as it comes out. But download it, make sure it's in your podcast feed, and you'll never miss an episode. Thank you very much for hanging out with us again on another edition of Rico Brogna.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Rico Brogna podcast. It's amazing, isn't it? Make sure you download it now to keep it on you at all times.